Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagatgurum. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hope you all had a nice break. We had 3 weeks? A 3-week interval between classes, so I hope you had a nice break, and I had a wonderful time in India and Bangkok. Lovely, about a week in Belurmat, and I brought back some small gifts for you guys. So at the end of class, I'll distribute them, so just don't run away after class. All right. And I continue to be impressed with your thoughtful responses to the study questions, both online and in person. The online people are really hardcore, and some of them have a lot of background knowledge, so you'll see some of that soon. Some people are drawing on some of Aurobindo's obscure poems to illuminate what he's saying, and essays on the Gita and other things. I'm very impressed. Anyway, so keep up the hard work and the good work. Here's the, I don't want to say bad news, but just a heads up. See, the last Sunday of the month, I'm going to be in Trabuco Canyon, which means that if we want to continue with our 2 classes per month kind of schedule, we'll need to have our next class next Sunday. I hope that's okay. Now, to make things a little easier for you guys, I've only made 2 study questions for the next reading. So it's not a huge... The reading is fairly substantial. Here's the reading, okay? Pay attention, please. You need to read verses 1 through 38 of chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita. Verses 1 through 38, okay? From, I would recommend that you have this edition, right? That edited by Anirban Roy, Bhagavad Gita and its message.
Chapter 2, you said?
Chapter 2, verses 1 through 38, just the verses, in Sri Aurobindo's translation. And then read chapter 7, the next chapter in Essays on the Gita, called The Creed of the Aryan Fighter, pages 57 to 67 of the Complete Works edition of Sri Aurobindo. Okay, that's the assignment for next week. Now, what you'll notice is, if you flip to page 57, this is the beginning of this chapter that we're going to be discussing next week. There's a footnote to the title, which says Gita 2.1 through 38. What does that mean? This is the first time, not the first time. In a previous chapter that we discussed earlier, Sri Aurobindo was discussing different verses in chapter 1. Now he's going to be doing that with respect to chapter 2. He's going to be discussing the verses, not in much detail. What I would like to do, this is a bit unusual because I've taught this before, but I didn't follow this procedure, but I'm going to do it this time. I'm going to try it out with you guys, the guinea pigs. We're going to obviously go through word by word Sri Aurobindo's commentary. At the same time, I think it will be very helpful for us to go through the Gita verse by verse. Not chapter 1. We're done with chapter 1 now. Well, once we finish today's class. But starting with chapter 2, I want to go through it verse by verse, starting with the very first verse. Okay? Which means, fortunately for you, we're going to be discussing this next chapter for a long time. A long time means a few weeks, because I'm not going to be able to go through 38 verses in one class. I probably won't even start, or I might just start next week. And then there won't be any new additional reading from Essays on the Gita. Instead, what I might do eventually, and another heads up, I would encourage you to purchase Shankara's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, available here in the bookstore, or also online. It's very common. It's Gambhiranandaji's translation. Why? Why do I suggest this?
Good.
The idea is Shankara's commentary on the Gita is the first extant commentary on the Gita in existence, which means there were prior commentaries, except that we don't have those. We only have records from the fact that Shankara himself says, hey, you guys are all confused. Let me tell you what the Gita actually says. So that means that there were previous commentaries which he disagreed with. But we don't know what they are. Okay. Probably some Bheda kind of commentaries. So every subsequent commentator, more or less, is aware of Shankara's interpretations and is in dialogue with his interpretations and often disagrees with his interpretations. And Sri Aurobindo certainly does that, because he often explicitly and even more frequently implicitly is in agon with Shankara in his, do you understand agon? It means in competition, or not competition, but in a kind of like he's arguing with Shankara. Shankara is one of his main dialogue partners when he's discussing the Gita. Okay? Even when he doesn't explicitly name Shankara. That's why, even in order to understand properly Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Gita, it helps to have an understanding of Shankara's interpretation as a kind of counterpoint or foil. Okay? So for all these reasons, I would strongly encourage you to, if not purchase a hard copy, then just get the soft copy of Shankara's commentary on the Gita, translated by Gambhiranji. There are a million translations, but his is, I think, the best, most scholarly. So now in the upcoming weeks, so next week we're just, as I said, read verses 1 through 38 of chapter 2 of the Gita, and then read chapter 7 of Essays on the Gita, the Creed of the Aryan Fighter. And then in subsequent weeks, we'll be going through chapter 2 verse by verse, and I might assign parts of Shankara's commentary rather than new chapters from this. Any questions about next week?
And so when we're reading it in this, not in this. Not in this.
That's Chidbhavananda. Just forget about Chidbhavananda.
Just read it in here. Okay.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Okay. So let's begin. Today we're discussing chapters 5 and 6 of Essays on the Gita. Chapter 5 is entitled Kurukshetra. Chapter 6 is entitled Man and the Battle of Life. Both very interesting chapters. In terms of the study questions, I think all of you did a good job overall, and that, in my opinion, the trickiest question was question 4, having to do with the difference between Nirguna and Trigunatita. We'll get to that. And the question on which many of you wrote voluminous dissertations was the one on the caste system, or the kind of ancient Indian system, social system, versus the modern one. A lot of you had many, many interesting thoughts on this. We're not going to be able to discuss all of your different reflections on this, but I'm going to paraphrase some of the important issues raised there. But let's begin with chapter 5, Kurukshetra, page 42. Because at least 5 or 6 of you were asking about the term soul force. What is this mysterious soul force? It sounds so cool. It is good. I don't think Sri Aurobindo has anything against it. He doesn't define it. Okay, let's read right from the middle of the page 42, where he says, or not right above the middle. So he says, "It is impossible, at least as men and things are, to advance, to grow, to fulfill, and still to observe really and utterly that principle of harmlessness, which is yet placed before us as the highest and best law of conduct. We will use only soul force and never destroy by war or any even defensive employment of physical violence. Good, though until soul force is effective, the asuric force in men and nations tramples down, breaks, slaughters, burns, pollutes, as we see it doing today. But then at its ease and unhindered, and you have perhaps caused as much destruction of life by your abstinence as others by resort to violence. Still you have set up an ideal which may someday, and at any rate, ought to lead up to better things. But even soul force, when it is effective, destroys. Only those who have used it with eyes open know how much more terrible and destructive it is than the sword and the cannon. And only those who do not limit their view to the act and its immediate results can see how tremendous are its after effects, how much is eventually destroyed, and with that much, all the life that depended on it and fed upon it. Evil cannot perish without the destruction of much that lives by the evil, and it is no less destruction even if we personally are saved the pain of a sensational act of violence." So I think the key to understanding this passage is the historical context, which is early 20th century. Many freedom fighters are fighting for India's independence from British colonial rule. One of the most prominent at the time was, Sri Aurobindo and Gandhiji. Sri Aurobindo had already kind of stepped down from his role as a freedom fighter, but Gandhiji was playing an outsized role in the freedom movement. And his key concept was satyagraha, ahimsa, But satyagraha literally means holding on to truth. And now, let's listen to how Gandhiji defines satyagraha. Okay? This is his method of gaining independence from the British. Gandhiji says its root meaning is holding on to truth. Satyagraha, hence truth force. I have also called it love force or soul force. In the application of satyagraha, I discovered in the earliest stages that pursuit of truth did not admit of violence being inflicted on one's opponent, but that he must be weaned from error by patience and compassion. This, in a nutshell, is Gandhiji's approach to gaining freedom. Don't resort to any physical violence at any cost. It's never necessary. It's never justified. Seems to be my understanding of what he's saying. Sri Aurobindo has this in mind, I think. He's in dialogue. He's now taking into account, in the context of Gita, which is very interesting, Gandhiji's idea of soul force. And he's saying, well, what about Gandhiji's idea of this strictly non-violent notion of soul force? And he gives two replies. He says, number one, by not committing violence, you might be causing even more violence by being passive and letting the aggressors, like, just imagine World War II much later, right? But if the Allied forces hadn't intervened, what might have happened? Now, we don't know. One counterfactual scenario is Hitler might have conquered all sorts of lands and, wrought even more destruction, right? Yeah. This seems to be the logic. So that's the first point that he's making against this Gandhiji kind of idea of soul force being always and at all times nonviolent. And then he adds a really subtle point about soul force, how he's saying that, but notice that Gandhiji is assuming that soul force is not violent, but in fact it could be even more violent than ordinary physical violence. That's another kind of interesting point he makes. And so he's not against soul force. That would be a mistake.
So, what is soul force for me again? I didn't understand the word itself. The rest of the explanations make sense, but what is he referring to? Soul force?
His idea is, instead of using physical might, physical force, we should use our divine soul force, non-violent soul force, in order to gain independence from the British. That's Gandhiji's idea. Okay. So I hope that clears up the soul force issue.
Thank you.
Sure. So now, a few pages later is where we get to the heart of, I think, this chapter 5, Kurukshetra chapter. What is the main message? What is the main point he's trying to make in this chapter? All of you got it right. It's at the bottom of page 44, but I think it's really important to just read it so it gets stuck in our heads. At the bottom, we erect a God of love and mercy, a God of good, a God just, righteous, and virtuous, according to our own moral conceptions of justice, virtue, and righteousness, and all the rest. And all the rest, we say, is not he, or is not his, but was made by some diabolical power which he suffered for some reason, to work out its wicked will, or by some dark Ariman, which means this is Zoroastrianism, counterbalancing our gracious Ormuz, or was even the fault of selfish and sinful man who has spoiled what was made originally perfect by God. As if man had created the law of death and devouring in the animal world, or that tremendous process, and it goes on. Okay, what's his point? I think this is a powerful critique of some common mainstream understandings of God in some of the mainstream religions. Arguably some forms of Abrahamic religions.
I feel like it gets even better as they start saying it is only a few religions.
So we can read that. There's a lot to cover, that's why. So it is only a few religions which have had the courage to say without any reserve, like the Indian, that this enigmatic world power is one deity, one trinity. What's the trinity? Remember the Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, which means creator, preserver, destroyer. God the destroyer is a crucial part of the Hindu God. To lift up the image of the force that acts in the world in the figure not only of the beneficent Durga, but of the terrible Kali in her blood-stained dance of destruction, and to say, this too is the mother, this also know to be God, this too, if thou hast the strength, adore. And it is significant that the religion which has had this unflinching honesty and tremendous courage has succeeded in creating a profound and widespread spirituality such as no other can parallel, and so on. So, saying there's something very distinctive about the Hindu God, which is that it doesn't sort of flinch from the idea of God as destroyer. That's really important. Kali the destroyer. Now, does this remind us of any of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings? I hope it does. But one obvious one is in the context of the problem of evil. Vidyasagar, the great Pandit, he raised this issue of, well, Genghis Khan's killed so many people and God witnessed all that evil. Why didn't he do anything? And Sri Ramakrishna says, is it possible to understand God's actions and her motives for acting? She creates, she preserves, and she destroys. Can we ever understand why she destroys? And Swamiji wrote some wonderful poems on Kali, for instance. For terror is thy name, death is in thy breath, and every shaking step destroys the world forever. Thou time, the all-destroyer, come, O mother, come, who dares misery love and hug the form of death. Dance in destruction's dance, to him the mother comes. And in a Bangla poem he wrote on Kali, Nachuk tahate Shama, let Shama dance there. I talked about this in a lecture a while ago. He says, many people who are afraid of the destructive aspect of God, of Mother Kali, they replace her bloody mace with Krishna's flute. So that's a nice way of putting it. Okay, so that's, I think, the keynote of chapter 5, Kurukshetra. And this is what he thinks that the Gita is constantly telling us. Never forget, God is also destroyer. Gita Stevens, a devotee from San Diego, who contributed her responses online, she points out that this phrase, God the destroyer, is used in chapter 11, verse 32 of the Gita. And she also notes, Micah too, by the way. Micah's joining us for the first time. Thank you for responding to the questions as well. Micah makes a nice connection with Vijnana, Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana, you know, my favorite hobby horse. He says, the realization of Vijnana entails that everything must be seen as a manifestation of God, and that will necessarily include violence and strife. And Gita Stevens says basically the same thing, but using Sri Ramakrishna's concepts of Vidya Maya and Avidya Maya. And Gita says, it is you have to accept all of Maya, including Avidya aspect, which is all the evil that we see and ignorance, and Vidya Maya, which are spiritual qualities and all that. But she's both. And the Vijnani sees that God, Brahman, has become the 24 cosmic principles, which means both Vidya Maya and Avidya Maya. Anurama, not to be outdone, another online participant from India, she quotes from his poem Life and Death to illustrate or to kind of illuminate the main point made in this chapter. And let me read you this. It's very striking, actually, this verse. It's an English poem. He says, life, death, death, life. The words have led for ages our thought and consciousness, and firmly seemed two opposites. But now long hidden pages are opened, liberating truths undreamed. Life only is, or death is life disguised. Life, a short death, until by life we are surprised. I love the last line. Life is, this is just flipping the thing. Life, a short death, until by life we are surprised. The real life starts after death. It's very interesting. Anyway, so thank you, Anurama, for mentioning that poem of his. So now, so the plan for the rest of the class is we're going to discuss some aspects of chapter 6, Man and the Battle of Life. And there are a ton of questions, both among you guys and also online. So I want to try to address many of them at least. Okay, so first of all, please flip to the beginning of chapter 6, page 47. Chinmoy had a question about a huge sentence on this page 47, which I think is dense, and I want to close read, because I think many of you might have similar questions. So, this is about the middle of the page 47, beginning of chapter 6. Sri Aurobindo says, if in fact we do not regard existence, it's a huge, like 15 to 20 page, 20 line sentence. Yeah. If in fact we do not regard existence merely as the mechanic action of a brute and indifferent material force, what is he referring to here? What school of philosophy? Any idea?
I mean, I don't know what it's called, but it's just like a materialistic, scientific.
Sort of, yeah.
Kind of like.
That's true.
Happen and it's.
Right, so it is a materialistic, scientific, and on the Indian side. Yeah, sure, why not? But force, I'm not sure, but maybe. And there's also a spiritual philosophy that also subscribes to this, interestingly. Any idea? Widely considered to be the most ancient school of Indian philosophy. Come on, guys. Sankhya? Yeah, correct, Sankhya. Sankhya also believes this.
Huh.
Yeah. Prakriti is insentient, and it just goes on its own. The three gunas are just acting on their own. There's no God as creator in Sankhya. So I think he has in mind, in the Indian context, Sankhya. In the Western global context, Western materialism, maybe scientific materialism, stuff like that. Now, the massive sentence continues. Or, on the other hand, as an equally mechanical play of ideas and energies arising out of an original non-existence. Pause. What school now? Any idea? Any thoughts?
Buddhism?
Yeah, what school of Buddhism? There are many sub-schools.
Mahayana.
Yeah, it is Mahayana, exactly. But even Mahayana has multiple... So I think it's the Shunyavada school of Mahayana Buddhism. Because Shunya means
Yeah.
non-existence or emptiness. Or at least it's one interpretation of Shunyavada, of this doctrine of emptiness, in the Mahayana school of Buddhism. Okay?
Yeah.
Which he talks about elsewhere as well. Third possibility. This is a third way of viewing existence. Or else reflected in the passive soul, capital S soul, or the evolution of a dream or nightmare in the surface consciousness of an indifferent, immutable transcendence, which is unaffected by the dream and has no real part in it. What school? Yeah, this one is, you guys are experts in. Exactly. Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta, according to which the only reality is non-dual pure consciousness, non-dual Brahman, which is impersonal, and everything else is mithya. Brahma Satyam Jagat mithya. It's just a kind of dream or nightmare. But it's even more radical than that, because a dream has a dreamer, and there's a period when we had this mistaken idea that we were in this dream. All of that turns out to be false too. There never was a dream or a dreamer. There's just Brahman all along. But I think he has in mind classical. So in this one sentence, he's surveying these three different possible ways of understanding existence. First, the Sankhya view. Second, the Buddha Shunyavada view. Third, Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta view. Now, the sentence continues. If we accept at all, as the Gita accepts, the existence of God, notice, none of these three positions which he just mentioned has any role for God to play in existence. Do you see? Including Sankhya. Okay. If we accept it all as the Gita accepts the existence of God, that is to say, of the omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, yet always transcendent being who manifests the world and himself in the world, who is not the slave but the lord of his creative consciousness, nature or force, maya, prakriti or shakti, who is not baffled or thwarted in his world conception or design by his creatures, man or devil, who does not need to justify himself by shifting the responsibility for any part of his creation or manifestation on that which is created or manifested. Then the human being has to start from a difficult act of faith. This is finally we get to the subject and the verb, the main of this huge sentence. Okay, so he's contrasting the Gita's understanding of existence, in which God plays a crucial role, with these three other understandings of existence, the Sankhya, the Shunyavada, and the classical Advaita Vedantic. What's distinctive about the Gita conception? God. And God is understood in a particular way. The term that's used these days in theology and philosophy of religion is panentheism. Panentheism. That is the idea that God is both immanent and transcendent. And notice how he's emphasizing both aspects here. So that's really important to keep in mind. At least this is Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Gita. I think it's a plausible one if you look at just the plain meaning of the verses too. You'll find there are many verses in the Gita talking about God as immanent, manifest in the world. There are many verses talking about God as beyond this world and completely unaffected by the world. So it's equally both. Okay? All right. So that, I hope that responds to Chinmoy's question. Now we get to, let's look at page 50. This is that question number 3 on caste that a lot of you had interesting reflections on. Kiran makes a very interesting point, which I should mention, which is, she says, I don't see where Sri Aurobindo claims that the ancient Indian social structure is superior to the modern social structure. That was the language I used in the question. But assuming he does, I personally don't think one is particularly superior to the other, but rather we could learn about both to hopefully try and get the best of both. And so I went back to the relevant pages. And what I found is that I think you're probably right, that I think I could have nuanced the statement. And that I think it might be an exaggeration or an oversimplification to say that Sri Aurobindo just considered the ancient Indian system to be superior to the modern Western one or whatever he's thinking of, the modern one. So let me try to nuance it. Here's my understanding. I think Sri Aurobindo recognizes the advantages and disadvantages of both the ancient Indian social system and the modern social system. I still think that on balance he prefers the ancient Indian one because it has two key features. And all of you got at least one of the features. Some of you missed the second feature. First feature of the ancient Indian system is that system tries to honor and understand and help us to cultivate our individual temperaments, preferences, personalities, and help us to find that calling, that vocation, that line of work, that kind of life, that mode of being that best accords with our swabhava, right? But the second is equally important, more important in a way. That whole idea of swadharma, swabhava has a spiritual foundation and a spiritual orientation. And the main aim of ancient Indian society was to foster our spiritual growth and evolution by means of helping us to follow our swadharma. And so what Sri Aurobindo finds lacking in the modern system are both these things. Number one is that it encourages us to do everything without really looking so carefully at what our particular proclivities are and our temperament is. And secondly, it doesn't have that spiritual foundation or orientation. Now, another thing to keep in mind here, and I think some of us got confused because of this. When I was talking about the modern system, some of you thought I meant the 2023 system. But actually it's about the modern system in his time, the contemporary. That means early 20th century. That means 1910s. That system's not the same as it is now. Now we enjoy all sorts of freedoms, and we go to college and we can choose our major, and then we can choose what we want to do. But I don't think that's what Sri Aurobindo had in mind. He couldn't have, because he was writing over a century ago. Do you see what I mean? I think the system was different then. I don't think it was as... in a way, here's another way of putting it. The current system here in the US, for instance, I think has a healthy dose of the ancient Indian system, which is that I think that part of what's good about our society and our educational system is that it does encourage us to find that calling or that vocation that best accords with our temperament and our preferences, even in a way that in contemporary India you don't find. It's starting to change, fortunately, in India. But often there's a huge stigma against certain fields in India, and stupid people usually go into humanities in India. All these, and so the smart people go into sciences. There are all these things which you don't find as much in the West, which I think actually is more in line with the ancient Indian system. So I just want to nuance both the question and the kind of the overall picture of how we should think about this. Another nuancing that's required. Some of you almost but not quite associated the ancient Indian system with the current caste system, which is obviously a mistake. None of you actually equate them. Sri Aurobindo is definitely not doing that. He's not equating the ancient Indian social system with the caste system as you currently have it. The caste system, as we see it now, is a hereditary caste system, which is not what he had in mind. What he had in mind, and which he thinks the Gita taught, is a caste system, varna system, based on guna and karma. These are the two Sanskrit terms used constantly in the Gita itself. Chaturvarnyam maya srishtam guna karma vibhagashaha, says Krishna. Krishna created the caste system based on guna and karma. What is guna? Your innate qualities. What is karma? Your behavior. Now, the question is, why did this original wonderful caste system that was non-hereditary based on guna and karma so quickly degenerate into the pernicious caste system that we have now, and which has stuck with us for so many centuries? That's an interesting sociological question and historical question. We're not going to go into it now. But the point is, the facts are facts. It did degenerate. Okay? But we should keep these two things separate. And then another question is, well, if it so quickly degenerated from this wonderful caste system into this really terrible one, then maybe it's not as practicable a social system as we might think. That's another issue that some of you raised, I think, in the questions. Okay? And then a number of you, like Niranjana and others, you raise issues about the practicability of this ancient Indian sort of social system, and asking things like, well, concretely, what does it look like? Like, what if I, in my teens, or let's say early adult years, I really want to be a doctor and serve people, but that after 30 years, I want to do something different. Will this Indian system, is it flexible enough to accommodate that? Like an evolution even in my swadharma, in the course of my life? Who decides what my swadharma is? Is it me, myself? Are there wise elders who kind of Like in colleges now in the U.S., you have career counselors, people that kind of help you, like have you fill out questionnaires and surveys and then kind of help guide you. Who are these people? Are they trustworthy? Are they competent? So there are a lot of these questions about the practicability and the execution of this kind of social system. Even though it's wonderful in theory, how practicable is it, and how open is it to abuse by people who want to take advantage of the system and for their own privilege, to aggrandize their own power. Okay, so that's a kind of paraphrase of a huge amount of discussion that you guys offered on this question, but I think we should leave it at that. I should mention one more thing, which is that a number of you did point out that in the historical context, that when Sri Aurobindo was railing against the modern idea of universal conscription, military conscription, that everybody has to serve in the military regardless of who you are and whether you're an artist or a doctor, that was very much of his time, right? This is World War I-ish time, and that's no longer the case in most countries, although Israel, they do make everybody fight in the army, for instance, the military. But anyway, okay, so that's enough, I think, on that issue. And
I'm grateful she said something about the superiority, because I felt like you were imposing that as an opinion instead of it, but I couldn't find anyway.
So I think she's right about that. I think that I should have been more nuanced in the question. So page 54. Now we get to what I think is the trickiest question. Nirguna versus Trigunatita. So let's look at the original passage. Sri Aurobindo says, but there comes also a stage in which the mind recoils from the whole problem of the three gunas, and dissatisfied with the solutions given by the threefold mode of nature, Traigunya, seeks for some higher solution outside of it or else above it. It looks for an escape. What does the it refer to? Here's one of those typical questions when you read Aurobindonian sentences. What does the pronoun it refer to? Yeah, good, very good. Mind in the previous sentence. The mind looks for an escape, either into something, notice the word something here, into something which is outside and void of all qualities, and therefore of all activity, or in something, again something, which is superior to the three qualities and master of them, and therefore at once capable of action and unaffected, undominated by its own action in the nirguna or the trigunatita. It aspires to an absolute peace and unconditioned existence, or to a dominant, calm, and superior existence. The natural movement of the former attitude is towards the renunciation of the world, sannyasa, of the latter towards superiority to the claims of the lower nature and its whirl of actions and reactions, and its principle is equality and the inner renunciation of passion and desire. Let's finish the paragraph. The former is the first impulse of Arjuna, recoiling from the calamitous culmination of all his heroic activity in the great cataclysm of battle and massacre, Kurukshetra, losing his whole past principle of action, inaction, and the rejection of life, and its claims seem to him the only issue. But it is to an inner superiority, and not to the physical renunciation of life and action, that he is called by the voice of the divine teacher. Now, what I think most of you got right in your answer to this question is that Krishna is obviously encouraging Arjuna to be Trigunatita, to lean on that side rather than the Nirguna side. And you guys, I think, correctly pointed out that the key difference with respect to action in the world is you're not renouncing physical actions, you're continuing to perform them, but without being affected by them. So as a karma yogi, okay, but still doing your swadharma. What I think many of you missed, I think the majority of you, but not all of you, is this, and this is my interpretation, you can argue with me. I find it useful sometimes, actually often, when you're trying to understand what Sri Aurobindo, what does he mean by Trigunatita, Nirguna, to run a keyword search on the soft copy of Vedanta Gita. And I immediately found this passage, which I think is very illuminating. Pages 232 to 3 of Vedanta Gita, in my edition. Let me read it. Sri Aurobindo says, the Purushottama, inhabiting all existences as the secret Ishvara, controls the nature, and by his will, now no longer distorted and disfigured by the ego sense, the nature works out the actions by the Swabhava. So this Purushottama means the divine Purushottama, the impersonal, personal, supreme being. Then he says, the individual soul makes the divinized natural being an instrument of the divine will, nimitta matram, a mere instrument. That's a term taken from the Gita. Then Sri Aurobindo says, he remains, that individual soul remains even in action trigunatita. You see how he's beyond the gunas, free from the gunas, nistraigunya. He fulfills entirely at last the early injunction of the Gita, nistraigunyo bhavagna, be devoid of the three gunas. He is indeed still the enjoyer of the gunas, as is the Brahman, though not limited by them. Unattached, yet all supporting, even as is that Brahman. Okay, so now, why do I think this passage helps to illuminate what's going on here? The thing that I think most of you missed is, I highlighted the fact that he's referring to something here twice, the word something. See, the mind looks for an escape either in something which is outside and void of all qualities, and therefore of all activity, or in something which is superior to the three qualities, master of them. Many of you thought of this nirguna and trigunatita as states of mind, as states of consciousness that Arjuna can potentially attain. He can either be in the nirguna state or in the trigunatita state. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I think there's another element which is missing from most of your answers, which is that those states correspond to different conceptions of ultimate reality. Okay? Two different kinds of something. That's what I think Aurobindo means by something. So there are two possibilities, two solutions to the problem of life, spiritual solutions. One is, there are two ways of getting beyond the gunas. One is by merging in non-dual pure consciousness. This is the Nirguna Brahman of Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta. And you can be like the salt doll melting in the ocean. This is Sri Ramakrishna's analogy for that state of consciousness in Nirkalpa Samadhi. That's why Sri Aurobindo aligns that with sannyasa, because in Shankara's tradition, anybody who's qualified to practice Jnana Yoga, the path of Advaita Vedanta, must renounce externally as well all actions. Okay? But now, by contrast, there is a different conception of ultimate reality which corresponds to this trigunatita state. God himself, according to the Gita, or herself, is the trigunatita purushottama. That's what I think he's saying in this passage in 232, the one that I just read to you. The purushottama controls the nature and but see, and this is a keynote throughout his commentary on the Gita. In chapter 3, Krishna will say, Arjuna, you have to fight. You should be a karma yogi. Who's the ideal karma yogi? Me, Krishna says. I am the ideal karma yogi. I'm God. I have nothing to gain from this action, but I do it in order to serve others, in order to help to keep this world going. And if I stopped even for a moment, the world would collapse, he says. This is all chapter 3. We'll get to it later. But what's the idea? The idea is that the divine Purushottama himself in the Gita is the ideal Trigunatita divine being who is beyond the three gunas and yet who continues to act constantly in the world. And he's saying, so I am your role model, O Arjuna. Be like me. Be beyond the three gunas, but not affected by them, while still engaged fully in action in the world, as a karma yogi. Does that make sense? So that's what I think was, I think missed by most of you, but which I think is really important, is that he's encouraging Arjuna to try to elevate himself to the state of consciousness of the Purushottama, and to merge his will and being into the will and being of the divine Purushottama, who continues to act in this world, and just be an instrument of that divine Purushottama. Okay?
You got all that out of it?
That's what I tried to get out of it. Okay, so now, for the remainder of the class, we have 20 minutes, and I would like to get to questions here, because there are a million. Okay. Okay, Soul Force I covered, Chinmayas I covered. Let me get to some other people before I get to... she had another question, but... Okay, Anurama. Anurama asks, I'm not sure if Trigunatita is different from Drashta, Sakshi, from Drik Drisha Viveka. If so, how are they different? I hope it's clear now. Because Drik Drisha Viveka is a text from classical Advaita Vedanta that has to do with this Nirguna Brahman. And I think Sri Aurobindo is clearly contrasting the Nirguna Brahman of Advaita Vedanta with the Trigunatita Purushottama taught in the Gita, according to Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. Micah asks an interesting question about this passage that we just read on page 54. Micah asks, I'm not clear on the use of the term outside on page 54. Sri Aurobindo argues that Nirguna Brahman is outside of the gunas, He uses the term outside here, where he says, Sri Aurobindo says, it looks for an escape either into something which is outside and void of all qualities and therefore of all activity, or in something which is superior to the qualities. So you're referring to that word outside there. Okay. Sri Aurobindo argues that Nirguna Brahman is outside of the gunas, but I don't think classical Advaitins would say that gold is outside of the gold ornaments. Good. So the thing is, Advaitins almost never use the gold in the gold ornaments analogy precisely because it doesn't suit their philosophy very well. So that's why they love ropes and snakes more. And they use the rope snake analogy, and they say that this world is like a snake that we mistake. We think it's a snake, but in fact it's a rope. And I think it does make sense to say that the rope is completely outside the snake, right? Because there's no element of the rope in the snake, in a sense. I mean, you might say there might be some superficial similarities, but golden ornaments is an analogy taken from the Chandogya Upanishad, among other ones, like clay in pots as well. And I have a lecture on this which you can look at. That's a class called Much Ado About Clay Pots, where I talk about this, and what I point out is that these Upanishadic analogies, gold, ornaments, clay, pots, lend themselves much better to a Ramakrishnan, Aurobindonian, Vijnana kind of interpretation, precisely because the gold is clearly not outside the golden ornaments, the golden bracelets and the golden earrings. And the clay is clearly not outside the clay pots of any size. Do you see what I mean? So I think actually this gold ornament analogy you bring up actually poses a good philosophical challenge to classical Advaita Vedanta. And this is one of the reasons why Sri Aurobindo disagrees with classical Advaita. And it's the classical Advaitic interpretation of the Gita, which he also thinks is more in line with Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana idea. Padma. Oh, okay, the ancient social struggle. We've talked enough about that, so I'm not going to go into that. Shriman. He's from Berlin. When Sri Aurobindo calls modern war a grotesque absurdity, is that not him recoiling from a universal destroyer? He asks us not shy away from death and destruction, and then immediately in the next chapter says things like, a day must surely come when humanity will be ready for the reign of universal peace, page 49. While he does admit that modern war is an atrocity, he has a rather optimistic view that eventually in the future it will not be this way. But if destruction is always a part of life, where is he getting this optimism from? Is this not just lip service to accept the concept of destruction for now, while ultimately aiming for some kind of utopia? Shouldn't a Vijnani be able to display what we see as tamas and destruction and horror, just as much as they display what we see as sattva and peace and love? This is a very interesting question. Because he's pointing to the fact that on page 49, Sri Aurobindo does seem to be saying that eventually humanity will evolve to the point where...
Well, he says a day may come.
May come.
May come.
Where's the may? Where are you seeing the may?
A day may come.
What page are we talking about?
Oh,
yeah, there we go. 49, middle. A day may come, must surely come.
Okay.
Ooh, just to anticipate Niranjana. We will say, when humanity will be ready spiritually, morally, socially for the reign of universal peace. See, so now this is interesting. Shriman is saying, well, I'm noticing a kind of tension here, because on the one hand, Sri Aurobindo is saying, especially in the previous chapter, you have to accept that destruction is a fundamental part, a necessary part of world existence. And now Sri Aurobindo seems to be saying that there probably will be or must come a time in the future
when humanity will be ready.
When there will be no more evil, and so now it raises several important issues. I think one of them is this question of eisegesis, one that we talked about a lot in previous classes. Is Sri Aurobindo reading his own philosophy and his own ideas into the text at certain points? That's one question. And if you've studied some of Sri Aurobindo's work, you'll know that his philosophy is all about evolution, spiritual evolution, and he firmly believed that humanity, the current state we're in, which is a state of mind, is not the final stage of evolution, but that eventually we will evolve to the stage of supermind. And humanity will be divinized. That's why his masterpiece is called The Life Divine. And he does project a certain kind of spiritual utopia in the future. He doesn't say when, but he seems to say that it will come. Now, I don't think he's too heavy-handed in trying to read that into the Gita. I think this is one place where he does, and I think Sriman is very astute in noticing that. But I think he's careful in general not to read too much of his own ideas into the Gita. But that's you decide for yourself. But that's a great point. So thank you for that, Sriman. But I didn't really respond to the question. So is there a tension between these two things?
No, because even when you still have spiritual at the highest, you still have life. You still have life and death. So you still have, this,
no, Sri Aurobindo will literally say things like the very cells in our body will eventually become immortal, like things like that. It's very interesting. It's very heady stuff in the like page 1000 part of Life Divine, stuff like that. It's different. This is where Sri Aurobindo actually differs from Sri Ramakrishna, as far as I can tell. And that's why this is another point that I liked about Sriman. He's bringing up Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnani here. And he's saying, shouldn't a Vijnani be able to accept the destruction and horror just as much and see everything as God? Sri Ramakrishna saw everything as God, including all the sordid and the evil, right? And Sri Aurobindo does too, but then says, but even the sordid and the evil will eventually disappear in the course of the divine manifestation. And so I think there are some important differences too between Sri Aurobindo and Sri Ramakrishna, which are important to keep in mind. I'm going to be writing a whole book on this, and I'll talk about those nuances as well. Yeah.
So the other related point I was thinking about was, I see it more of individual from their own perspective, this evolution, whereas in some cases is mixed up with like the society's evolution.
Mm-hmm.
To me, Gita, even when I answered the other question around the two systems, I mean, there were always people who wanted to be worldly, independent of what the social structure just people behave as, I think, driven by their nature in the past, even now in the future. So should we be looking more this as a individual, like subjective growth aspect rather than some places where he's mixing up the society's evolution?
Are you asking about Sri Aurobindo or Gita?
Sri Aurobindo. He's kind of mixing.
I know, but the Gita sort of does too, right? That's the thing, is that Gita talks a lot about Swadharma and the Varna system, the caste system, which is all about society, right? But at the same time, Gita is also very much invested in our own individual spiritual development. So I think Sri Aurobindo's toggling between these two standpoints, I think, because they're interrelated. This reminds me of Peace Pilgrim, for instance. How many of you read Peace Pilgrim? There's a great book on this great American saint named Peace Pilgrim. None of you? Really? Wow, it's less known than she should be. She's an American saint, born and raised in Boston.
Didn't you talk about this recently?
Maybe, I don't know. And she became a kind of a sannyasi, and she just walked all over the country. She called herself the Peace Pilgrim. She didn't have a coin in her pocket. She slept, I don't know, on the streets or somewhere where people would let her in. And this was at the time of the Vietnam War and all that. And she said, look, you can never have external peace without inner peace. And so she was really pushing this inner peace stuff, and she was really channeling Vedanta, but without explicitly saying that I'm a Vedantin or anything like that. It's very interesting, so I recommend that. But I think there's something similar.
So
yeah.
I asked the same question,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't hear an answer to it.
Okay.
I think there's an inherent contradiction
Mm.
between what Sri Aurobindo is saying,
Mm.
must surely come on the one hand,
Mm.
and saying also this is inherent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the Sriman's
Talking
question.
out of
Yeah.
both sides of, I know, but it's a critical contradiction
Yeah.
unless it's understood differently. So how
How is it a
might
contradiction
understand
if
it
it's an
differently?
evolution? Because you're saying something's inherent.
No,
That's
I'd like
fine.
an answer though. I mean, or some.
I think Sri Aurobindo's answer is,
something to look at.
in the current state of
Right.
humanity, evil and suffering and physical violence are inevitable, and that we have to accept that, but that humanity will eventually evolve to a point where that's no longer the case. That's how I see it. But yeah.
So yeah, I was just gonna say the way when I read that part, the way I kind of thought about it is like when you think about destruction, it doesn't necessarily mean like a violent thing. Because even Sri Aurobindo, when he says the soul force, he doesn't say violent. He just says destructive.
Mm-hmm.
So, but to me, destructive doesn't necessarily mean like a bad thing. Like
Mm-hmm.
you destroy maybe
Breaking down of ego or something. Or,
yeah.
Mm.
Like it's more like you have to let go of things that
Mhm.
are no longer whatever beneficial or
Mhm.
something, and then get onto like a better level of even of who you are.
Mhm.
Let's say like that. You don't
Yeah.
say that you're destroying yourself.
Yeah.
You could think of it like as an act of destruction.
Destroying
in
the
the
lower
sense-
self and then the building of the higher self or
but
something.
just kind of like
Mm-hmm.
that's
Yeah.
the way I
Which is a
Yeah,
dialogue.
that's another way of thinking about it.
Right.
But I think fundamentally what he thinks is that in the current state of humanity, Gandhiji's ideas of radical, absolute nonviolence is unrealistic. And that at the same time, the way that modern warfare is waged is also unethical and unfair in certain ways, and that we can take tips from the way that war was waged in the ancient Indian past. That's another part of it. And that eventually, when humanity evolves, hopefully evil and suffering will not, and destruction will not be necessary, and violence will not be necessary.
Or maybe it is necessary because it's one of the three aspects of God.
Right, exactly. So that's
in everything, but it has to be perceived differently, which is
right. But what you're suggesting is a critique of the Aurobindonian
I am.
philosophy.
I
Yeah.
think he's contradicting himself.
So I think we should keep that on the table.
I don't
Yeah.
think I'm understanding fully.
No, I think you are understanding it fully. I think you disagree with Sridharavan. So that's fine. So you should feel free to.
But anyway.
No, I still don't think so. I think that he thinks that. I see. Okay, and so maybe we can combine Kiran's point with yours and say like, there might be a different way of understanding the destructive aspect of God that doesn't necessarily involve suffering and physical violence.
Right, time is an example.
Time the destroyer.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, the natural world is constantly breaking down. We're the ones that are kind of inputting, well, as
Yeah.
supposedly inputting energy to kind of keep things together. But
Yeah.
when we let things go, they just naturally break down.
Yeah, these are good questions. I mean, let's keep them on the table and just not. I don't want to give superficial answers, so just keep them as questions and then try to answer them for yourself. Kiran has a question about page 43. What exactly is the principle of association and the force of dissociation? On page 43, he says, strife and destruction are not all. There is a saving principle of association and mutual help, as well as the force of dissociation and mutual strife, a power of love no less than a power of egoistic self-assertion. Where on the page is that?
So it's kind of like
The
at
second
bottom.
paragraph.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Strife and destruction are not all. There's a saving principle. Yeah. I don't think he's saying anything too deep. I think he's saying that there are always these two polarities. On the one hand, there's destruction and dissociation, there's disagreement, there's tension between people, and then on the other hand, there's the positive side. Association in the sense of you get together with other people to do something positive. That's how I take association. And mutual help, right? So the two things go hand in hand, association, mutual help, as opposed to dissociation, where it's like man against man, and mutual strife, where you're fighting with each other, disagreeing with each other. That's how I take that. More questions. Okay, Gita Stevens asks, in the last class you ended up bringing up free will and said there's no free will in the viewpoint of the enlightened. But if we can be united in one with God's consciousness, then we inherit God's freedom. She's also thinking of my lecture on this free will. Do we have free will? And then, she says it now. And then in your free will talk, you said this is because then, with Vijnana, we realize that God is playfully manifesting as ourselves. Then we are free as God. Does Sri Ramakrishna say anything specifically about free will or freedom like that? I would love to have that reference. I don't think so, is the answer. What I give in my lectures, and even more so in my scholarly work, are what I call reconstructions of Sri Ramakrishna's views, which means that it's my best understanding and reconstruction of what he's saying, but he doesn't necessarily say all the things that I'm attributing to him. But I think it's like consistent with the logic of what he's saying. So does he ever say that when we attain the state of Vijnana, we inherit God's freedom? I don't think so. I think it's implied, but it's not explicitly stated. And Padma asks, I would like to understand more about Sri Aurobindo's preference for the ancient social structure. He gives an example of how war is fought in the modern times versus only the samurais, kshatriyas fighting in wars. How much of his preference for the ancient structure is driven by the horrors of world wars and his own experience with the Indian freedom movement? Yeah, so I think that's true. I think it does have to do with his own time. But also, as I said, the modern context in his time is different from the current modern context. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the current system in the West, for instance, I think, at least in the US, does have elements of the Indian social system, the ancient Indian social system, which is what the freedoms that we enjoy in choosing our line of study, line of work, and so on. Micah's second question is, I don't understand what Sri Aurobindo means on page 49 when he says that a monstrous massacre is the means modern man has found for the establishment of universal peace. Is this statement sarcastic? And so let's look at the statement. Page 49. Top. Even now, we have not actually progressed beyond the feasibility of a system of accommodation between conflicting interests, which may minimize the recurrence of the worst forms of strife. And towards this consummation, the method, the approach, which humanity has been forced by its own nature to adopt, is a monstrous mutual massacre unparalleled in history. A universal war, full of bitterness and irreconcilable hatred, is the straight way and the triumphant means modern man has found for the establishment of universal peace. Exclamation point. I think the exclamation point is signaling that it is sarcastic and that he's being pretty scathing here in his criticism. Yeah. So just because he says that violence is sometimes necessary doesn't mean that he approves of all forms of violence. So he condemns the way that war is being waged in his own time, World War I. Yeah. Okay, any questions from the in-person group? We have a few minutes. Or I can take more online questions. Okay, I'll take more. In the meantime, more online questions. Anurama, the one who knows Sri Aurobindo's poetry as well, from India, she asks, page 41, last but one sentence. Sri Aurobindo writes, if this repellent aspect of existence holds in itself some secret of the final harmony, we shall, by ignoring or belittling it, miss that secret, and all our efforts at a solution will fail by fault of our self-indulgent ignoring of the true elements of the problem. This might actually speak to this issue raised by Anthony and by Sriman as well. Anurama's question is, what is the secret of the final harmony that Sri Aurobindo is referring to here? Do you follow the question? This passage, right? The repellent aspect of existence is destruction, evil, right? If this repellent aspect of existence holds in itself some secret of the final harmony, so she's asking, what the heck is this final harmony? We shall, by ignoring or belittling it, what is the it here? What is it? The repellent aspect of existence, exactly. Miss that secret, the secret of the final harmony. And all our efforts at a solution will fail by fault of our self-indulgent ignoring of the true elements of the problem.
I think he refers in earlier paragraphs harmony as the harmony of the destruction side as and the other. I think he talks about it some.
Well, where? If you can point to exactly what you think he has in mind, that would be helpful. I kind of see him bringing in his own idea of this kind of spiritual utopia in the end, where humanity evolves to supermind. And there's a final harmony in which that evil and ignorance and destruction that we see now becomes transmuted into something divine. And in that sense, still plays a role in the final harmony, but transmuted. It's no longer evil, but it plays an important role in the final divine harmony that he envisions in the future.
I think it might be as simple as doing what you need to do and offering it all to God, which is what he says right here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, meanwhile, the aspect of battle and the nature and function of man as a fighter have to be accepted and accounted for by any practical philosophy and religion.
That's true, but what is the final harmony then? That's Anurama's question.
Well, no, I understand that, but the final harmony is basically you offer it all to God, and therefore it dissipates. It's all part of the same thing. I don't know, I can't articulate it that clearly, but the point is Arjuna didn't want to fight, right? He thought, this is horrible, and he's taught why he needs to fight, and how to offer it to God. So I don't know, I haven't gotten to the Gita in this class, so I don't know the ultimate answer.
My reading is I align the final harmony here with the Sriman Anthony question, which is that this future state he envisions in which there will be universal peace. I think the two things are sort of moving in the same direction, especially in light of my study of Sri Aurobindo in general, because that's one of the main themes of overall spiritual philosophy.
But he also says that one aspect of God is the destroyer. So again, it's contextualizing that properly.
Yeah, and as I said, Kirtan is giving one way of doing that by understanding God the destroyer in a different way. Like, God can still be the destroyer in a less physically destructive way in the future.
That, but also right now when he mentioned this, I think it's just more like when you give, I mean, at the end, it's just more like realizing that you are not the door. So that, I think that's when you would say it's no longer a problem. You know what I mean? Like, it's no longer.
All that stuff you're saying, I agree with, but that's all from the Ramakrishna standpoint. What I'm saying is that there are distinctive, unique elements to Sri Aurobindo's worldview, which I don't think Sri Ramakrishna would be on board with, is what I mean. And one of those is this utopian future, spiritual utopia. And it's, number one is a question of to what extent he's reading that idea of a future spiritual utopia into the Gita. That's one serious interpretive question which we need to ask ourselves. And that's up to you to decide. And secondly, to what extent do you even subscribe to this idea that humanity will evolve beyond the current state of mind to a higher state of consciousness? These are both open questions. Whether or not that's in the Gita, that's a kind of separate issue about Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. Yeah.
What is the difference in first and two? I mean, the second has to follow the first, right?
What is first and second?
Points. You just said 2 points right now.
No, I forgot what my 2 points are. But
I mean, the future utopia.
Do you mean the repellent?
Okay. One is about interpreting the Gita. The other is about Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. So the question about the Gita is, as we study his commentary on the Gita, as we continue to, okay, keep in mind that one key aspect of Sri Aurobindo's own spiritual philosophy is that eventually humanity will evolve beyond mind to the stages of overmind and then eventually supermind and so on and so forth. Okay? So the question with respect to interpreting the Gita is, number one, does he read that into the Gita in a way that's illicit, like in a way that is eisegetic, and which he shouldn't do?
Right.
We're beginning to see some glimmers of that, possibly, but he doesn't directly say that I find this in the Gita exactly, but he might say, like in verse so-and-so, there's the Krishna envisions a future utopia. I don't think he does, in general. But anyway, be alert for whether he does that. That's the first question, with respect to Gita exegesis and interpretation. The second question is, just as a yogi and as a spiritual, personage, as a figure, who had his own highly original spiritual philosophy, Sri Aurobindo, to what extent do I agree with his view of spiritual evolution? And whether humanity will eventually evolve, apart from the question of whether it matches what the Gita is saying.
Does he refer to humanity as in everyone at the same time will evolve?
Not necessarily. It's very nuanced, and he doesn't say that everybody, and not necessarily every single person.
Because it might make sense if you say everyone is moving towards the goal of transcending, which I think there is no doubt, and it aligns with Ramakrishna's teachings.
No, but there will be a time, I don't know when.
Saying everybody at the same
almost
time.
Everybody, at least.
Okay.
Just like, think about it. There was a time when there were very few humanoid. Right? Yeah. I mean, when there were only like 2. Now everybody, there's a huge number of them, the billions. I think in that way, there's going to be a time when there are very few supermen, and then eventually that will become more generalized. That seems to be his idea. Okay?
Is that going to the Anulom Vilom? Like going
Sri Ramakrishna has this idea of, in explaining Vijnana, he explains Anuloma. Yeah, I think that, exactly, involution, evolution. Yeah. I think Sri Aurobindo was, first of all, he was explicitly influenced by Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijnana. And I think the Anuloma Viloma teaching really does capture this involution, evolution. Swamiji also talks about involution, evolution in his lectures. And that God is involved in everything in that technical sense. And Sri Aurobindo's whole theory of evolution is based on that. At the same time, you rarely, I think you never find in Sri Ramakrishna, and you rarely find in Swamiji, but you do find on some little occasions, hints of a future spiritual utopia. Swamiji says, in an obscure place, that in the future, Jivan Muktas will be born out of the womb, or yogis, he says. He used the word yogi, I think. And that there will be he also says, with the Ramakrishna incarnation, the Satya Yuga has begun. Yeah. And that in the future there will be this golden age, when you won't see these tamasic qualities and kama and krodha, but when everything. So, I mean, there are the little hints, and Sri Aurobindo just has a field day with those little hints and turns it into this very elaborate spiritual philosophy and says that this must happen eventually, because that's that's a logic of evolution.
Yeah.
What is within, what is involuted, what is involved must eventually evolve and manifest. That's just the logic of evolution. Okay. All right. Thank you. That was an excellent discussion, and I'll see you next Sunday at 9:30. Only 2 study questions and 1 chapter. And so read verses 1 to 38 of chapter 2 of the Gita first. Then read the next chapter of Essays on the Gita, chapter 7, the Creed of the Aryan Fighter. and answer the 2 study questions. And try to buy either a hard copy of Shankara's commentary or get a soft copy of this. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. All right, now for the small gift. A little token from India and Belumat. Can you form a line maybe, or I don't know, whatever's easier, because